We often mistake silence for peace, assuming that the absence of an argument is the presence of a bond. I spent 10 years believing that Clara's quietness was a sign of her contentment, never realizing that a heart can turn to stone while you are still holding it in your hand. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the person sitting across from you at dinner has been a stranger for a very long time. This is the story of Julian Vance and his wife Clara Vance. Their marriage was built on the steady, reliable rhythm of a shared life morning coffees, comfortable silences, and the mutual pursuit of a future that always seemed just one promotion away. But beneath the polished surface of their suburban success, a thin layer of emotional neglect had begun to frost over their intimacy. Julian, driven by a quiet ego and the need to provide, often missed the way Clara's gaze lingered on the exit signs of their life together. This is not a story of a sudden explosion, but of a slow erosion, where pride and the need to feel seen eventually led them to a table where everything they owned was gambled away in a single sentence. The invitations to Arthur Sterling's estate were never just requests, they were summons. Arthur was more than my boss. He was the sun around which our entire firm orbited, a man who believed that wealth wasn't just about the numbers in a bank account, but about the gravity one exerted over others. "Do I have to wear the silk dress?" Clara asked, her voice drifting from the walk-in closet. There was a flatness to her tone that I chose to interpret as tired rather than reluctant. "It's Sterling's 50th, I said, adjusting my cufflinks in the mirror. "Everyone who matters will be there. Appearance is half the battle in that room, Clara. You know how he is." I didn't look at her when she stepped out. If I had, I might have noticed the way she was twisting her wedding ring, a nervous habit that had returned in recent months. Instead, I grabbed my coat, checked my watch, and thought about the regional directorship that was currently dangling just within my reach. I needed this night to be perfect. I needed Clara to be the perfect asset. The Sterling estate was a monument to glass and cold stone, perched on a hill that looked down on the rest of the city. As we walked in, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the low hum of practiced laughter. Arthur greeted us at the door, his hand lingering perhaps a second too long on Clara's waist. "Julian, glad you could make it," Arthur said, his eyes never leaving my wife. "And Clara, you look absolutely radiant, almost too good for a room like this." "Thank you, Arthur," Clara murmured. She didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. She just stood there, a statue of silk and compliance. Throughout the dinner, I felt a strange prickle at the back of my neck. I was seated across from Clara, while Arthur sat at the head of the table, flanked by his most loyal lieutenants. I watched them interact. There was a shorthand between them, a way he would catch her eye when someone said something pretentious, a way she would smile at his jokes before the punchline was even delivered. It felt like watching a play where I was the only one who hadn't been given a script. I told myself it was just business. Clara was helping me. She was being charming because she knew how much this promotion meant to me. I ignored the way Arthur's hand moved under the table, and I ignored the way Clara's breathing hitched when he leaned in to whisper something in her ear. Then, as the main course was cleared and the wine flowed a little too freely, Arthur tapped his spoon against his crystal glass. The room fell silent. He stood up, looking flushed and triumphant. "I've spent 50 years taking what I want from this world," Arthur said, his voice carrying that booming, dangerous confidence. "And I've learned that the most valuable things aren't bought, they are surrendered." He turned his gaze toward our end of the table. He pointed a finger directly at Clara. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. It was the look of a man marking his territory. "Tonight," Arthur said, loud enough for every partner and spouse to hear, "she comes with me." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of a joke gone flat. It was the silence of a vacuum. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at Clara, waiting for the laugh, the outrage, the glass of wine thrown in his face. But Clara didn't move. She didn't object. She slowly lowered her eyes to her plate, her hands resting perfectly still on the white linen. The lack of a protest felt louder than any scream. In that moment, the hairline cracks in our marriage didn't just spread, they shattered. The drive home was a descent into a private hell. The city lights blurred into long, distorted streaks of neon. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt a wave of nausea. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her head turned toward the window, watching her own reflection. "Say something," I finally whispered, my voice cracking. "What do you want me to say, Julian?" she replied. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It lacked the jagged edges of guilt or the softness of an apology. "He claimed you, like a piece of property, in front of my peers, in front of the people I have to lead." My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "And you sat there. You let him say it. You let them think." "I let them think what, Julian? That I'm an object? That I'm a prize to be traded?" She turned to look at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the raw, pulsing resentment in her eyes. "That's how you've treated me for years. I was the perfect asset for your dinners. I was the beautiful wife for your firm's Christmas photos." Arthur just had the decency to say it out loud. The accusation hit me harder than the public humiliation. I wanted to defend myself, to talk about the house, the security, the life I had built for us, but the words felt hollow. I realized then that I didn't know the woman sitting next to me. I had been so focused on the mountain I was climbing that I never noticed she had stopped following me miles ago. "How long?" I asked. "6 months," she said. "It started with lunch." He listened to me, Julian. He didn't check his phone. He didn't talk about his quarterly projections. He asked me why I stopped painting. He asked me if I was lonely. "He's a predator, Clara. He's using you to get to me, or just to prove he can." "Maybe," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "but even a predator's attention feels like warmth when you've been living in the cold for so long." The realization shifted something inside me. I had spent our entire marriage thinking I was the protector, the provider, the anchor. But I had been a ghost in my own home. I hadn't lost her at that dinner table. I had lost her in the quiet evenings where I chose my laptop over her conversation, and in the mornings where I kissed her cheek without looking into her eyes. We pulled into our driveway. The house, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now looked like a museum, elegant, expensive, and utterly lifeless. "He told everyone you were leaving with him," I said, the image of Arthur's pointing finger burning in my mind. "Why didn't you go?" Clara unbuckled her seatbelt and looked at the dark windows of our bedroom. "Because I wanted to see if you would stop him. I wanted to see if there was anything left in you that cared more about me than your career." She opened the car door and stepped out into the chilly night air. I sat in the dark, the engine ticking as it cooled, realizing that I had failed a test I didn't even know I was taking. The next morning, the house was filled with a thick, suffocating stillness. There was no shouting, no slamming doors. We moved around each other like two people navigating a shipwreck, careful not to step on the debris. I found Clara in the kitchen, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. I sat down across from her. I had spent the night rehearsing a speech, a list of demands, an ultimatum, a plea for us to go to therapy. But looking at the hollow expression on her face, the words died in my throat. "I'm resigning," I said. Clara looked up, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "You've worked 10 years for that position. You're weeks away from the board's decision." "It doesn't matter," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. "I can't work for a man who views my marriage as a conquest, and I can't stay in a marriage where I've become the enemy." Clara let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "Is this for me, Julian, or is this for your ego? Are you quitting because you love me, or because you can't stand the thought of being the man whose boss took his wife?" The question was a razor. It cut through my self-righteousness and exposed the messy truth underneath. I wanted to say it was for her. I wanted to be the hero, but there was a part of me that was simply humiliated. A part of me that wanted to take my ball and go home because I didn't like the rules of the game anymore. It's both, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I don't know where one ends and the other begins. Clara stood up and walked to the window. Arthur called me this morning. He said the offer still stands. He said he'd make sure you got a generous severance if I followed through. The room seemed to tilt. And what did you say? I told him I'd think about it, she said. She didn't turn around. Not because I want him, but because for the first time in a decade, I have leverage. I have a choice, and it's terrifying how much I enjoy that feeling. There was no explosion, no dramatic accusation of betrayal, just the cold, hard fact that our relationship had become a series of transactions. I realized then that we couldn't fix this by staying together. The air between us was poisoned by years of things unsaid and months of things done in secret. I think you should go, I said. Clara turned, her face masking a flash of surprise. To him? No, I said. Just away. From him. From me. From this house. We're both performing for an audience that isn't there anymore, Clara. I'm going to pack a bag and stay at a hotel. You decide what your next move is. But don't do it for Arthur, and don't do it to hurt me. Do it because you actually want the life you're choosing. I walked out of the kitchen, my heart heavy but my head suddenly clear. I didn't feel like a winner. I didn't feel like I was reclaiming my dignity. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion. The bridge hadn't burned in a spectacular fire. It had simply rotted until it could no longer support the weight of two people. 6 months later, the world had moved on, as it always does. Arthur Sterling had been forced into an early retirement following a series of personal conduct investigations I had quietly helped facilitate with a few well-placed files I took on. My way out. It wasn't revenge. At least, that's what I told myself. It was just an accounting. I was living in a smaller apartment closer to the city center. The silence here was different. It was the silence of solitude, not the silence of neglect. I had started a small consulting firm. I worked less, slept more, and spent a lot of time walking through the parks I used to drive past in a hurry. Clara had moved to a coastal town 2 hours away. From what I heard through mutual friends, she hadn't gone to Arthur. She had rented a small studio and was painting again. She sent me a postcard, once a picture of the ocean with no message on the back, just her signature. It was a gesture of existence, nothing more. But as the months passed, I found myself falling into a trap of self-deception. I began to rewrite our history in my mind. I told myself that the dinner at Arthur's was the only moment that mattered. I convinced myself that if I had just stood up and punched him, or if I had stayed at the firm and fought, things would be different. I missed the Clara I had invented, the one who was always happy, always supportive. I ignored the Clara who had been drowning in plain sight. I decided to visit her. I told myself it was for closure, that we needed to sign the final divorce papers in person. But the truth was, my ego was lonely. I wanted to see if she missed the life we had. I wanted to see if she regretted leaving the security I had provided. The drive to the coast was beautiful, the air turning saltier and cooler as I approached. I found her studio in a refurbished warehouse near the docks. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine hit me as I walked in, a scent I hadn't realized I associated so deeply with the early, happy years of our marriage. Clara was standing at an easel, her back to me. She looked different. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she was wearing an old shirt of mine, stained with streaks of cobalt blue and ochre. "The light is better in the mornings," she said, without turning around. "I knew it was you by the way you walk. You still march like you're late for a board meeting?" "I'm trying to slow down," I said, stepping further into the room. She turned then, and the sight of her took my breath away. She didn't look like the woman in the silk dress. She looked tired, her hands were stained, and there were faint lines of stress around her eyes. But she also looked present. She looked like she was actually inhabiting her own skin. "I brought the papers," I said, holding up the envelope. "Thank you," she said, wiped her hands on a rag. She looked at the canvases lining the walls. They were chaotic, vibrant, and deeply unsettling. They weren't the pretty landscapes she used to paint. They were studies of shadows, of hands reaching for things, of faces half hidden. "You're good," I said. And for the first time, I wasn't saying it to be a supportive husband. I was saying it because it was true. "I'm honest," she corrected. "There's a difference." We stood there for a long time, the sound of the gulls outside the only thing filling the space between us. I realized that the turning point I had been looking for wasn't a reconciliation. It was the devastating realization that she was better off without the version of me I had been so proud of. We sat on the small deck of her studio, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. The water was a bruised purple, reflecting the fading light. We hadn't signed the papers yet. They sat on the table between us, weighted down by a smooth stone Clara used as a paperweight. "Do you ever think about that night?" I asked. "At Arthur's." Clara took a sip of her tea, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think about it every day, but not for the reason you think." "Why then?" "Because it was the first time I felt invisible and seen at the exact same time," she said softly. "Arthur saw my unhappiness and tried to buy it. You saw my presence and assumed it was permanent. That night was the moment the illusion of our perfect life finally died." It was a relief, Julian, a horrible, public, humiliating relief. "I'm sorry," I said. The words felt small, but they were all I had. "I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I thought providing for you was the same thing as loving you." Clara reached out and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was rougher than I remembered, calloused from her work. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I'm sorry I let my resentment turn into a weapon. I shouldn't have let Arthur say those things. I shouldn't have stayed silent, but I was so tired of screaming inside that the silence felt like a sanctuary." There was no sudden surge of passion, no cinematic realization that we should try again. That would have been a lie. Instead, there was a profound sense of grace. We were two people who had failed each other in the most human of ways, and we were finally being honest about the cost. Clara picked up a pen and signed the papers. Her signature was bold, no longer the shaky script of the woman at the dinner table. She handed the pen to me. I signed my name below hers, the ink drying quickly in the salt air. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I'm going to keep painting the shadows," she said with a small, genuine smile. "And you? Are you going to keep climbing?" "I think I've seen enough of the view from the top," I said. "I think I'd like to try staying on the ground for a while." I stood up to leave. We didn't hug. We didn't promise to be best friends. We simply looked at each other, really looked at each other, and acknowledged the people we had become. As I walked back to my car, I realized that some things have to break completely before they can be understood. Our marriage wasn't a tragedy because it ended. It was a tragedy because of how long we had let it live after it was already dead. The humiliation at the dinner table wasn't the end of our story. It was the brutal, necessary beginning of our truth. I drove away, leaving the coast behind. In the rear-view mirror, I saw the light in Clara's studio go on. It was a small, steady glow against the gathering dark, a sign of someone finally finding their way home, even if that home was a place they had to build alone.